talking about our final module, our final class or type of recreation resources, and this is wildlife. So this is going to necessarily leave off things like soundscape, dark nighttime skies, and air quality as resources. Just haven't got that far this semester, but let's blast on through wildlife. There's a bunch here. So how many of my folks in class today are WAMCon students? Only a couple this time. Wow, usually it's closer to half. All right. So this is not wildlife from a zoological perspective. Like soils, like water and so forth, we're not talking about just the pure physics dynamics of those resources. We're talking instead about what are the specific ins and outs, what are the weird aspects of managing wildlife specifically relative to humans being in those habitats and coming specifically to those habitats for recreation reasons, right? So keeping a bear alive is one thing in a zoo, and it's a completely different thing in a busy urban proximate national forest like the Shawnee, right? Completely different mindset, reasoning, approach, all of it. Okay, so that's kind of the sense in which we are doing things. Also, we're going to use sort of the so-called reductive Western logical positivist mindset or perspective on valuing wildlife, right? So there are lots of different ways among different cultures and worldviews to understand wildlife. For simplicity and straightforwardness sake, we're just going to delimit ourselves to that one so we can move forward quickly. But I'd be doing you guys a big disservice if I said there were not a whole bunch of other ways to think about it and do it. All right, so when you ask visitors why they showed up to your national park this semester, one of the top 3 reasons is pretty much guaranteed to be the wildlife viewing. That makes sense, right? National parks are typically draped around the core habitat of especially megafauna in the United States, and the preservation orientation or mindset of the wildlife habitat management ranger team are very much taking advantage of the sense of the way that America has put together its sense, its view, its understanding of national parks is to put them on core habitat. So we get wildlife management at a very high function level as a consequence of looking at recreation management partially as a function of wildlife management. All right? So again, we're looking at wildlife not from a zoological perspective, but from a valuing wildlife, valuing seeing wildlife, interacting with, photographing, viewing. That transforms into a motivation, and that leads to behaviors on site. So we have a lot of examples of this, right? So one thing we're going to talk about today briefly is the sense or idea of charismatic megafauna. Baby elephants, they're just like us. They like going down slides. So we tend to anthropomorphize charismatic animals that are perceived to be more like us than other species are. So warm-blooded, feathered, has a cute baby-like face, for example, tends to be more heavily anthropomorphized or valued or understood in that way. And what that means for you as a wildlife manager in a park context is that's the mindset that millions, up to millions of visitors are coming through your front gate with every year. So immediately it's incumbent on you to help them understand, hey guys, yeah, maybe, well, we don't really have any elephants in North America outside of zoos, except for when somebody has an illegal pet and they break loose or something. But we do have a lot of charismatic species, and so that's a useful example for us. All right, so we cannot separate having wildlife in their habitats in our national parks from the motives for people to show up, right? So a reason for people to go to Yellowstone, period, to spend thousands of dollars on travel and lodging and food, etc., is for seeing bears. And yeah, also things like Old Faithful and the other geothermal features. But the wildlife is typically one of the more exciting things, right? You can go and see and have your mind blown by seeing Old Faithful every 90 or so minutes. But it's not exciting necessarily in the same way to a lot of visitors as seeing the brown bear right next to Old Faithful just trying to do its brown bear things for that day, namely storing calories in the high plateau environment that Yellowstone National Park is. Okay, so we cannot extricate wildlife from this. We can't specialize down so much that we can just ignore the human element of managing wildlife. And this is true outside of national parks as well, right? Elk management in Colorado and Wyoming is like close to $1 billion industry every year, and it's a big deal, right? People go to these states specifically for these reasons, and they have family traditions, right? So this is baked into how they grew up. This is how they understand the world, right? We go and enjoy these things as a family, right? Very Fast and Furious perspective on things. Okay, so with our marine protected areas, we are looking for, fundamentally in the human brain, we are looking for stimulation. We're looking for sensory inputs. Classical authors would refer to this as sensuality, indulging the senses. And hopefully for most of us, right, that classical sense of sensuality doesn't have anything sexual about it. It's just like, it's really exciting to be in an environment and see a whale breach right next to your kayak or your boat or your ship. Okay, so this is super intense and closely held as a value. One problem we get is the divergence of, as a function of your training, your background, your exposure, your professional life and work, is that your sense of the wildlife that you are working with, or the visitors that you are working with who want to be close to that wildlife, your sense of the wildlife, your values, your understanding of those species starts to diverge basically immediately. So already, in subtle ways, you and I are thinking differently about wildlife as a function of this class, as a function of being a ranger, or a forester, or wildlife manager, whatever your job title specifically is. Right? We see it as something other than just a, oh my gosh, this is a really cool thing to encounter on the trail or along the park road. Man, this is the highlight of our trip. It's different for you when you're in, your ranger patrol vehicle doing a presence patrol and you see a bunch of caribou for the 1,000th time this week, right? You think about it differently than your visitors do. And what this can do in the practical management day-to-day thing is cause some problems, because where you are thinking differently than your visitors, right? It's harder and harder as time goes on, as you get more into it, to anticipate with your visitors, to pull close to them sort of cognitively and see it with the same sort of freshness and importance and vibrancy that they do, right? So for a lot of people who help or even volunteer to manage the bison herds as they cross the highway at Grand Teton National Park, south of Yellowstone, bison are amazing, and they're also just a huge pain in the ass, right? It's dozens of people directing traffic to stop the bison jams or keep the bison jams from becoming bigger and bigger problems. So we want to acknowledge this right at the top, and we'll come back to this at the end as we're talking about managing wildlife resources relative to humans. Okay? So you and I, we are trained as ecologists, among other things, or botanists, zoologists, etc., to see plant and, in this case, animal species as tools, as indicator species. How's our water quality doing? Let's check our frog population, or a salamander, or a mud puppy population, and so forth, right? Most of your visitors are not thinking about frogs in that way, and so they're going to behave in ways that don't pay a lot of attention to frogs. So, littering, for example, polluting water sources is thought of differently between you and your visitors for this reason, okay? So, pretty big deal. And we can get a sense of this intensity. We use an econometric measure, so measuring how people assign value to things through express use of money, or intended use of money. That's econometrics. This is not economics, this is econometrics, measuring things about people by the proxy measure of how they spend, how they save, how they allocate money, limited finances. So, when you ask folks, what would you be willing to pay to be able to go to Shawnee National Forest and be guaranteed seeing just a monster trophy buck every time you went? We can do that as land managers. We can make that happen, right? And it's very hard for us to make management decisions on what are we going to do with these wildlife species, how are we going to amend this habitat, where are we going to put this wildlife viewing platform, how much money are we going to spend on it? Is this going to be a big deal or just like a wide spot on the trail where we invite people to stand and look, right? We don't even build anything separate. We ask folks, or we look at how much folks are already paying for stuff like that, or how much they'd be willing to pay for a permit to do something like that, okay? So, we're going to be talking a little bit about human values at the outset here, and this is a way to put a quantitative, objective sense of what people are thinking. This is a way to take or coalesce meaning from the vapor of nuance. Coalesce meaning from the vapor of nuance, right? If you ask folks how much you're willing to pay for it, the conversation gets pretty clear and pretty serious pretty quick. All right, so econometrics is a tool in your toolbox. It does involve some math, but it's relatively simple math. Basic statistics, okay? So, for example, in 93, 30 years ago, a bear permit cost $50, but it was a lottery versus, and travel costs are fixed either way, right? So $1,000 to get there and back. Versus, would you be willing to pay 5 times more for a 100% chance at that lottery? Okay. So, what problems can you imagine as budding park rangers, nascent park rangers, in terms of charging more for a better chance at a permit? What benefits and or drawbacks do you see from this econometrically based approach? Reduce everything to dollars and then charge differentially for things that are harder to do or ecologically more difficult to sustain, what have you. Yeah?
You're skewing your visitors to people with more economic means.
Yeah. This favors the 1%ers, period. Right? So, in terms of, well, equity is kind of a loaded term these days in politics, but in terms of just fairness for your visitors, how about that? We have some real hard decisions to make. The lottery is more fair. The justice in a lottery is pretty blind, right? Now, even with a $50 permit, that can price some people out. And the fact that it is anything other than zero prices most people out, okay? For example, if you guys decide to be online influencers and 99% of your followers will never pay you a cent, and that 1% of your folks might pay something for whatever content you're generating, right? So, this is a thing we have to balance very carefully as park managers. And we have lots and lots and lots and lots. We've got mountains and years and decades worth of user levels, the entrance fees that people paid, how much they paid for their lodge room in Yosemite Valley or whatever, and so forth. So we can get a pretty good sense of what these numbers can be. It is your professional decision and burden or responsibility to figure out what they should be when you are working in wildlife management, right? So at least in the United States, most of this hunting stuff is managed at a state level, right? So IDNR has a whole division that does just whitetail management and so forth. And a big part of their work is doing the straight up field zoology of how many bucks, how many does we're gonna have this coming season, where do we set our tag limits and so forth. And the other half of the equation is how much we're going to charge folks for that fluctuating but set level of permits on any given year. Okay? Cool. So, this is complex. Everybody's got an opinion on it. Your opinion as the professional setting some of these numbers is going to be wrong to some people, and that's okay. You cannot please all of the people all of the time. A famous Illinoisan once said that. So, we're going to take that to heart. We also think about wildlife in terms of their ecosystem service value, right? So this is more than just a red fox. it is also soil nutrients on the paw before it is transformed by detritivores, agates in this case, into soil nutrients, right? So, for the non-charismatic species, things that tend to be more cold-blooded or more alien-looking or less relatable, we tend to pay a lot more attention to their ecosystem role, their niche, their function, versus your visitors, right? So your visitors are seeing this as scary or exciting or tasty. You are seeing it as all of those things plus the gator's enormous role in the aquatic freshwater ecosystems that it is in. Okay, so just a quick reminder that sometimes we have species that are not present on land, not highly visible, but we do, at least in this class, take the habitat management perspective, right? So a zoologist, a mammalogist, an ornithologist or ichthyologist, person who studies and works with fish, and so forth, right? They are doing the organism management. So a wildlife veterinarian, for example, is sterilizing overpopulated herds. The field zoologist is doing catch and release on species and so forth. We as park managers, we're taking kind of the bigger picture of we can't force individual animals to reproduce successfully. That kind of harshes their mellow. So instead, we can create the context for them to have, in that case, the breeding habitat that is intact and uninterrupted because visitors want to see elk during the rut. And that's a very sensitive and important time for elk population dynamics. And it's a really exciting time for visitors. So we're going to walk this thin line on bringing people to these habitats as a function of being park rangers, and bringing people to these habitats in a specific way to specific spots in that habitat that are going to minimize the impact of the presence of humans. So we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the impact of the presence of humans. Okay? So, just as a quick reminder for those of you who are not WAMCON students, we have, at least for the purposes of this class, basically 4, 5, 6 kinds of core habitat needs. We need feeding habitat, and this is a big one because a lot of wildlife species are going to be feeding during the day or at dawn and dusk. That is, they are crepuscular instead of diurnal. And this is where most of our visitors are going to see folks, right? Cover and denning habitat, not so much. When we went to Acadia National Park this past summer and we saw peregrine falcons on the cliff edge in their nesting, and so for them, cover and rearing habitat are basically the same thing. It's right at cliff edges, right next to cliffside and cliff scaling trails called Via Ferrata trails. But that's kind of the exception, right? Much more commonly, visitors are actually seeing on their own wildlife at Acadia and other places. The bald eagles and the peregrine falcons actually fishing out over the Atlantic Ocean. The right gray and minke whales, whichever ones aren't extinct yet, going on their annual migrations past Mount Desert Island at Acadia National Park. Right, we're seeing them in their feeding habitat or the migration habitat primarily. Okay, so we want to pay a lot of attention to feeding habitat and kind of think hard about that. All right, so for especially torporous creatures, so ones that are going to do like a winter hibernation, so bats, bears, all kinds of other like reptilian species, fish species as well, right? They have a set number of days in the growing season to pack on calories, and if they don't make it over that finish line, they are going to starve to death, period. So, we want to understand the dynamics of your visitors moving through these feeding habitats to enjoy your national park, their national park, but it is bringing folks into close contact with wildlife that is doing everything that it can to get soap berries up in Alaska and pack on the calories or whatever that might need to look like. All right, so this is the energetics study of each wildlife species at your park. how many calories does each male bison, each bull bison need to make it through the very cold winter at the Grand Teton Yellowstone ecosystem corridor, right? It is cold and snowy. And if they have to break trail through 6 or 8 foot high snow drifts, without the benefit of snowmobiles and snow machines or snowcats to groom the trails for them, and then paw away all of that snow to get at whatever little vegetation under hoof can provide just like a little bit of extra calorie action, they're having to spend calories to do that, right? So this is a careful balance. And if we are startling, alarming, displacing them off of this feeding habitat in peak feeding season, well then anything that is gestating young over winter, for example, which takes a lot of calories as well, right? We might starve mother and calf to death as well. So we have to pay a lot of attention to energetics, that calorie balance. And right, wildlife species are adapted to handle snow, to handle rain, of course, but the issue, the variable, is how much are we disturbing them and making their feeding less efficient, less effective per hour of browse time spent, okay? So things like grass, seed heads, not really that great for calorie and nutrient content. It's there, and they'll make it through the winter on that. It's their natural food, among other things, but yeah, it is tough, right? So when wildlife species are having to work extra hard to feed in the presence of humans, that means they're having to divide their attention between monitoring for natural predators and the global super predator class. So we're sensitizing the situation, we're making it harder on the wildlife merely by our presence. And certain wildlife species are very sensitive to even long distance human incursions. So elk, for example, they're going to start paying attention to a human in the wild if the human is upwind. At about a mile away, we start affecting their behavior, right? So think about how many national parks you're at where you're within 1 mile of the elk herd. We're automatically already affecting their behaviors at that point, okay? So, excuse me. So in the wintertime, all of these energetic issues are hugely exacerbated. You have to spend more, a much higher basal metabolic rate to just maintain body heat. And again, all these wildlife species are adapted to live in these ecosystems anyway, but when you add, and this is a real example pulled out of Yellowstone and the nearby national forests, when you add thousands of people going on snowmobile rides through the winter on noisy 2 or 4 stroke snow machines, they're disturbing bison and other creatures in these spaces, causing the bison to have to spend a whole lot of calories to try and post hole through snow and get away from the sound of these snow machines that might not even be in the same valley, right? So imagine you got people having a great time just tearing through Yellowstone Valley, Yellowstone Plateau on snow machines. We've got a line of hills, and then we've got a herd of bison stuck up in the high country for the winter, already at a bad situation for them. Snow machines go on, open up the throttle, have a blast, ramping off of stuff or whatever. And as the bison, you don't really know what that sound is. That's not an evolutionary adaptation that your herd has. And so that could be a pretty scary thing. So your herd starts even stampeding in the snow to get away from this unknown, possibly a predator, right? Because if they don't try to get away from predators, well then it's definitely going to go bad for them. So the gambling from the bison herd's perspective is to emphasize the emergency response, spend a ton of calories, and maybe a significant portion of the herd starves to death, right? And we've been working for the last century on getting bison back up from a few 100,000 animals in private herds at the end of the 1800s back up to anything close to like the Great Plains open range covered in bison from end to end. We're never going to get there, but wintertime recreation can make that management much, much harder. So the management response at Yellowstone was to change where those snow machines could go, pull the permits for a while until they could figure it out. And it is possible. There's lots of space to go snow machining around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, right? It's, I don't know what, 100,000 square miles. It's a big space. So we don't have to have the snow machines right on top of or right next to the bison, causing bison to ultimately starve to death. We can put them anywhere else, right? And so you, as the ranger, are working with the zoology staff to understand population quality and herd dynamics, genetic strength, starvation rates, that sort of thing. And you're working with your rec permitting staff to keep the companies that are making their livelihood on renting out those snow machines to guests at Yellowstone, trying to make everything work, right? We have plenty of space. We can make it work. We just have to be aware of these things by monitoring population health, figuring out the human motivation of snowmobiling fun, and sort things out spatially, and it all kind of works out. So it took, 10, 15 years for that work to happen, for that realization to hit, that, oh my God, these snow machines are causing our bison to starve to death. What do we do? And working it forward, right? So these are long-term projects, lots of moving parts, lots of interest groups, lots of laws that have to be followed and so forth. But the point is, you as the wildlife habitat manager and also the park ranger, you have control over these situations, right? And it might take 15 years to work it out, but you work it out, and then it's more or less a solved problem. But we keep an eye on it, make sure, okay? So, body heat, calorie needs increase in the winter, obviously. For species that have a particular acoustic niche, so for those of us not in wildlife habitat management or the zoology program, every species that vocalizes or has an auditory meatus, an ear-like structure, they have a frequency range or blocks or bands of frequency ranges in which they have to have clear communication channels, right? So the pitch of my voice is lower than this HVAC unit, so you can hear both of them at the same time. If they were the same pitch, you can only hear the louder of the two, right? So it might be soft and close to your ear, it might be loud and far away, but the effective loudness at the receiver's eardrum or ear apparatus determines what that species can hear. So, for example, when we have owls who are trying to hear wildlife running in snow, which is a natural sound absorber, a really good one too. Have you ever been walking out in the woods in a snowstorm, and it's like silent, it's magical, right? That is purely a quality, an attribute of the soundscape in that moment in that forest ecosystem. And so when you're running snow machines or cars on the road, right? People not even in recreation mode, they're just trying to get to their tent site or whatever, and not thinking about it, but the contact patch of the tire on the road, 55, 65 decibels of white noise. So that's pretty loud, right? It's like standing right next to a window AC unit that is running full blast and trying to have a conversation next to it, right? So our sounds can have huge and outsized, our noise pollution specifically can have huge outsized effects on predatory species and on the prey species that are listening for the almost acoustically completely silent hunters that are about to pounce in on them, okay? So we want to think about all of the features, all the aspects, all the characteristics and attributes of the ecosystem that you're managing in your national parks and tally up, okay, where are we making it harder for you to hear the predator hunting for you? Or where are we making it harder for you as the predator to find that next meal? Okay? Identify it successfully. So, migratory and mobile mesocarnivores, coyotes, wolves, on up, mountain lions, bears, they're going to need huge chunks of habitat. And those habitat polygons, for those of you in GIS, may have very little to do with the square boundary of your park, if your park is Yellowstone National Park, right? There's a reason that they manage Yellowstone, John D. Rockefeller Memorial Parkway, Grand Teton National Park, and like 6 different national forests, full-size western national forests, arranged in kind of a fan shape around, or as petals of the bud of Yellowstone National Park, because just the wolves alone need more space than all of that, right? Each of those packs needs a tremendous amount of space. So reintroducing wolves there over the past 25, 30 years has been hugely successful. It's a wonderful thing. And these guys don't care about your boundary lines and the extent of your authority as the land manager, right? So for wildlife, larger wildlife management in particular, you're gonna have to get pretty good at doing trans-border, trans-boundary management and partnership management, right? Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is mostly Forest Service land. And the Park Service isn't even in the same department, agriculture, that the United States Forest Service is in, right? So they have to figure out their differences in just basic culture, like vocabulary, right? Basic jargon, funding cycles, timing of things, seasons, right? Interagency cooperation is a big lift, and parks are literally in the center of these arrangements, okay? So, we want to think, sort of continue along this winter theme, for all of the wildlife that is trying to access food underneath drift snow or snowpack. The kinds of forest and outdoor recreation that we are enabling, so things like cross-country skiing, telemark skiing, for example, are usually on groomed trails, meaning we drive a Caterpillar vehicle with basically a snow blade on the front and so forth for evening out the snow for skiing and stuff like that, making it real skiable. That is competing and sectioning up. It's fragmenting the habitat, at least during the snowy months of the year, for species that are trying to survive in the tunnels under the snow, like we've talked about in the past, with the cryo resources, the frozen water resources, and for the predators trying to get after them, okay? So, this is difficult work. It is not a guaranteed meal in any way, right? If this is 2 or 3 feet of snow, it's gonna take a lot to pick up a scent of something insulated by 2 to 3 feet of aerated snow with very, very, very little airflow, right? So this is hard work for the species trying to get by this way. So we can't put trails across these spaces and expect no problems to happen, okay? Cool. Again, not a North American wildlife species, but we just want to emphasize the size of the animal typically increases the size of its habitat, and the size of that habitat need has nothing to do with the political conversation that set up your national park originally, okay? So we have to keep those migration lanes open. Going back to Yellowstone, the sense of fencing in each of the national parks as we originally did to keep out cattle, for example. There are a ton of ranches around Yellowstone, as you know if you've seen the TV show. Those barbed wire fences were absolutely ruinous ecologically, right? So this is the absolute worst case scenario of fence line ecology, as it's called, and so forth. In our southwestern parks, again, this is a savanna lion, not a cougar that we're used to. But anyway, watering holes are going to be a thing. So in places like Canyonlands National Park, the water hole for a 10 square mile habitat might be a single puddle or pool. And so everything's got to go there everything mobile's got to get there. Which is particularly tricky in a place like Canyonlands where you have constrained travel corridors in all these slot canyons and things like bears moving through that space as well. Everybody's concentrated onto the same dry washes at the canyon bottom to get somewhere. It's wild. And a little bit later we'll come back to large predatory birds with a bald eagle potential poaching incident as an example. So Just as a reminder, you have to get everything right on all of our other resource types so that habitat quality can be functional or at a functional level, right? So we're all familiar with how DDT, a pesticide, almost caused the collapse and extirpation of bald eagles, our national bird. Okay, so in places like Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge, which is a bit like a national park for us here in Southern Illinois, but has a different sort of priority or mandate. This is one of the places where we are seeing eagles respond very positively to cleaning up water with, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, etc. Okay, so you need lots of big habitat for birds. God, they need so much. All right. Also, for our entomologists, our insects, our pollinators in particular, are going to be super critical. So when we're talking about, remember we were talking about trails at the top edge of Tuolumne Meadows, cutting off water flow overland to feed and water the wildflower species at all of the rest of Tuolumne Meadows and areas like that at Yosemite National Park up in the high country, not down in the valley where all the tourism is concentrated, but way up in the wilderness high country. As the wildflowers go, so do your pollinators, and then so does kind of everything else. So trail management, for in particular managing drainage of water for all of the ecosystems downslope, has a huge effect on wildlife. So your wildlife team can't be cloistered or separated away from, or ivory towered away from, or siloed, I guess is the professional term, away from your trails team, right? So wildlife habitat managers, you might be directing where the trail crew needs to get some particular work done based on your wildlife monitoring, which is kind of a little bit indirect, but man, if we're not here to fix our trails so that we're not killing our pollinators, what are we here for in park management, right? Cool. All right, so that's feeding habitat stuff. Let's race through mating and rearing habitat. You guys all know the birds and the bees. If this is disturbing imagery, please look away. But we want to think about what's the calorie need, basically, for mating and rearing. Okay? So natality, that is successful live birth, or oviparity, that is successful egg-laying birth. It is not guaranteed at all. There's so many things that can go wrong, from the courtship and mating initiation phase all the way through sitting on that nest full of eggs, keeping them warm through the cold season, or through the hatching season long enough to raise and rear the next generation of young. Also, the rearing is extremely resource intensive, right? So birds, for example, have to feed themselves quite a bit, and then also feed all of their young continuously. So, again, acoustic niches are especially important for songbirds. So one thing we can do fairly quickly and easily for trying to get a sense of how is our acoustic habitat specifically for our vocalizing species that rely heavily on sound and making sound, and so forth, we can compare the level of ambient noise pollution at any particular spot. You just go out and set out microphone arrays. So this is sound trapping instead of photo trapping. And you compare the volume, the decibel level, against the local, for that same spot, dawn or dusk chorus. So North American songbirds, and a lot of songbird heavy ecosystems across the world, have a lot of vocalization in sort of the half hour before sunrise, after sunrise, before sunset, after sunset, right? So the birds are typically active all day long and feeding and so forth, but they're marking territory, they're signaling things to each other a lot at dawn and dusk. So here's an example of a dawn chorus mob in central Kentucky. It's not going through the speakers, but hopefully you guys can hear birds over the noise pollution. Does that make sense? Right, so the HVAC unit is acoustically fairly similar, but it's lower pitch versus the white noise, this is a brown noise frequency spectrum, of car engines, car drag, aerodynamic drag, and car contact patches sort of exploding air sideways out from under the tread of the tire and where it's pinched by the road. It makes that characteristic rushing sound. Above 25 to 35 miles per hour, that's actually the loudest part, the contact patch action over the motor and so forth. So from wherever you are in the room, this is what you can hear in between when I'm talking. Then we have a noise pollution problem right here in this thing. If instead you can still at least kind of hear the birds, well, that's still a problem, but it's less of a problem because in this case the birds are able to essentially overwhelm the noise pollution intervening in their stuff. And so the Stellendale Chorus thing is everywhere. Here it is. I'm going to say Rocky Mountain National Park. This may be too quiet for you guys. Anyway, it's birds. So, moving on. All right. So, all I have to say, we have a lot going on. So, unfortunately, either by design or by evolutionary mishap, animals have figured out every possible way to make it harder for themselves to reproduce successfully. Like some species of sea turtles, it feels like they're trying to die. But up until human takeover of pretty much all the beaches, all of everywhere, this worked mostly fine, right? Like we have lots of sea turtles up until that point. So this is unfortunately a very difficult issue to overcome and very, very, very intensive to manage, right? So we're all familiar with the numerous coastal communities, coastal state wildlife management programs that do things like patrol beaches 24 hours a day during sea turtle nesting season, fencing in their clutches of eggs so that poachers don't get them. I mean, just ridiculous stuff. And fencing in, the pile of eggs shallowly buried in the shore sand against people's just dogs, right? Who wouldn't want to walk your dog at sunrise or sunset on the beach? It's lots of fun, it's great for the dog, it's very healthy, but the dog is a carnivore, and it is going to do wolf-like things. And eggs are a wonderful source of nutrients if you're a predator. So, there is that. All right, moving on. Let's see. We all know about how plastic bags look a lot like the staple food of jellyfish for sea turtles and how that can cause gut obstruction. We'll get into gut obstruction and how that actually looks here in a bit. But this is just a very vulnerable time. So attraction, mating, breeding, gestation, and birth and rearing, like that whole season, which is most of the year for larger species, right? It's just hard. And so as a recreation manager, because this is an extended sensitive time for key species, you have the mandate, the license to restrict or very sort of obtrusively, meaning in people's face, steer recreation activities and presence or specific behaviors away from these spots. It's a huge pain in the ass to fence in sea turtle hatching sites. Like, that's a huge amount of work. And then you gotta tear it down some weeks later and store all that stuff for next year and train your staff on how to build fences, right? It's this huge lift, all because people like to have their dogs off leash or like to steal sea turtle eggs and sell them on the black market or eat them or whatever. So it's this huge amount of effort and it is absolutely justified. So this is a big, big lift, and that's okay. Unfortunately, the young of a species, especially mammalian and bird species, automatically rank higher on the charismatic fauna ranking list that we all have inside of our hearts, right? Who isn't on the inside saying, well, squee if you're a millennial? I say these days as a slang onomatopoetic term of how that makes you feel. Watching a cheetah groom its kittens, right? People are here for seeing calves and kittens, other young. This is, right? We're interested in this stuff. Okay, moving on. So, cover and denning habitat, pretty straightforward. And one creature's cover and denning habitat can lead to another creature's denning habitat. For a reptile, the back of a horse underneath the saddle is a nice warm spot in a cold winter, or a cold snap in the fall, or something like that, right? So, pit vipers are kind of an issue or concern at a lot of the more southern parks and so forth. Very occasionally, folks will be walking through the woods and break through into a pit viper den, and it's a bad day for everybody involved. So when we are forcing the wildlife to rely on their natural camouflage or their concealment and cover behaviors, that is stopping them, that's preventing them from doing whatever else they needed to do at that time. Feeding, rearing, scanning for predators, etc. Okay, so we'll get more into these wildlife responses to human incursion in a bit, but two of those are going to be called displacement and evasion. So low speed or high speed fleeing the scene, and they accumulate all of the calories that you lost during that fleeing episode. Well, you're already going to be working at 100% to eat as much as you can tomorrow, so this is just lost. And those losses accumulate, they add up over time. And again, if you don't get over that caloric finish line for the year, bad deal, okay? So, in national parks, we have the issue of people coming en masse. So, wildlife respond very differently to a single incursion per day versus 100 incursions per day or 1,000 incursions per day, which we can absolutely hit in busier front country areas. So we'll talk about the behavioral adaptations that help wildlife handle that. So one group that is disturbing wildlife at once for the day, like a big tour group, that's bad. But it's less bad than 10 groups at 1/10 the size of that massive tour group. So same number of people, but spread out through the day, so you're disturbing the animal 10 times in its habitat instead of just the once. That's even worse than the one big group, okay? So that can either cause actual extinction, or if you permanently displace the wildlife from that habitat onto more marginal habitat, less good stuff, well then it's functionally the same thing. The wildlife isn't in that space anymore, okay? So, a lot of wildlife species have a tell, or a bluff charge, or a defensive signal or vocalization to people when they are getting too close. But a lot of times people will misconstrue that, either out of just, well-meaning ignorance, not realizing that the bear is puffing up, about to front, get all up in one's grill. It looks like it's just curious, maybe, to the uninitiated. And sometimes people willfully misinterpret those defensive signals from wildlife. Okay, so that is tough. And if we are forcing an animal to come out of its den by getting too close to that animal and or its den, we're causing a pretty major disruption for a while. So it's not just calorie loss and distraction from scanning for predators, it is also things like stress hormone buildup. So, for example, when your professor walks down the aisle by your seat, what is happening in your blood at a biomolecular level is you are releasing things like adrenaline and cortisol as your body is waking up to the idea that, oh God, Dr. Park is walking towards me, and he doesn't normally do this in class. What's happening? What do I need to do? Is he about to ask me a question? He's going to make eye contact. I hate it when he makes eye contact. He's weird, and he's got that scraggly beard look. Anyway, right? So, you're accumulating stress hormones in your body. They're spiking. This is a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And it's a low-grade thing, right? Hopefully you guys are all safe in your classrooms. but the wildlife are doing the same thing. And so over time, for example, if you have elevated levels of cortisol in your blood, you are far more likely to die much younger of a heart attack. And you're going to be much sicker your entire life up to that unfortunate moment. So, biomolecularly, we are affecting these animals beyond just the calorie budget as well. Okay? So, may you never be a bear biologist in this particular position because, my God. All right, moving on. Let's kind of pivot now to from the different kinds of habitat to how visitors are thinking about wildlife. A lot of this is going to be pretty straightforward, so we'll move pretty fast. But we want to think pretty hard about it. All right? So again, this is a reminder. This is one of the main reasons we're even showing up to this park. Why we bought the plane tickets, why we spent the gas, whatever. Okay? And not all creatures are even or evenly accepted among visitors, and it's a problem, right? So among these two animals, which is more charismatic? Quick quiz. Why?
Looks gross.
The other one looks gross. Yeah. Okay. You see how we're all kind of agreeing with that? Like, this is not hugely surprising to people? We all tend to think along this line. Now, there will always be that person who really likes... Is this a sphinx cat? Yeah. Like, there's always going to be the person who has a special place in their heart for this. But again, we're talking about visitors in their hundreds of thousands or millions. We have to, at some point, draw some generalities and realize that a 5-year-old child is going to drop their parent's hand and run towards this creature because it's fuzzy, because its eyes are large relative to its cranium size. It has baby face proportions. Okay? And so that means something behaviorally for that little kid running towards this wild animal, and for the parents, and for the wildlife. Okay? How we tend to think about them. All right? So, according to studies, the larger it is, you tend to value it more highly in that way. Partially because it's just more visible, and partially because wildlife photographers have an easier time eliciting beautiful photos with their telephoto lenses of the massive elk, or something like that, or the golden eagle or the California condor or whatever, versus the tiny little insect. You know, the ants might have an outsized effect on the ecosystem structure and function, but people care a lot more about the caribou, the reindeer, than the ants. Okay? Charismatic species, if it's rare, threatened, or endangered, that automatically bumps it up on most people's list. Migratory ungulates, carnivores are very charismatic creatures. People will run towards large carnivores, and we'll see some videos of that maybe later. Hopefully I'll try not to scar you too bad, but yeah. Versus things like amphibians or lizards or snakes, yeah, right? A lot of us understand how important native snakes are to local habitats, of course, but most visitors don't think that way. So we have to, as managers, recognize that there's a difference between how we think about it, and they do, and make sure that we are aware of how people tend to do stuff. Okay? So, this is a video about Nene geese. We're not going to watch that because it's my face up close, and God, who wants that? Anyway, more characteristics of charismatic versus non-charismatic species, babies, and trophy specimens, right? So for our very largest migratory ungulate trophy specimens, that champion elk, or that champion moose, or what have you, right? People are going to see that as very charismatic, and a subset of people that see that as a very charismatic animal, meaning they place high value on encountering it, a subset of those folks are going to be okay with poaching that champion animal. Okay? So unfortunately, sometimes part of our work in this area is leaning very heavily on the law enforcement rangers, the LEOs, or the forest protection officers, FPOs, conservation officers at the state level, right? Interdiction is a thing, and we have some fun and interesting tools like ghillie suits and robotic deer. What a time to be alive. But we're still dealing with people with guns who want to do bad things, right? That is tough. Okay, so For all of our bearded dragon lovers, I apologize, but they tend to be less charismatic to folks versus mammals. Skin flaps, like with the Sphinx on bats, either has people, it's a very polarizing thing. So people either love and are super excited to see the bats, or they're super grossed out and they're like, I love this, but I hate it. And they're like, don't fly in my hair, right? Bats don't really do that. But anyway, moving on. Insects and arachnids, etc. Beetles, not so charismatic. It's like, that's a beautiful animal. But most people are like, ooh, gross, keep it away from the food, right? Which is a good thing. You do want to keep them away from the food. But, moving on. Anything that bites or stings, but is not already cool for some other reason, like it's furry, right? So, cougars, mountain lions, puma, sting, or they don't sting, they bite. Right, moving on. But, wasps, not so great. Goblin sharks, anemone, other sea creatures that have very few human-like external features. We have to think about them differently than our visitors do. And we have to be prepared, get this, for the visitor who sees a less charismatic species, like a gator, like a shark, like whatever, and destroys it, harms that animal, and wipes it out, thinking or justifying or rationalizing their actions as helping you, the ranger. Oh, well, sharks suck, so I killed this one. I've done a good thing, right? Sharks critical to the ecosystems that they help regulate. So, that is tough. All right, charismatic species. It's young, it's warm-blooded, it's fuzzy. Man, 10 out of 10. Or Reddit 5 out of 7. Goblin sharks, very rarely on Conan, as far as I'm aware. Okay. Long-lived species tend to be very charismatic. Gray parrots, for example, can live, a century or more? He's smiling, right? No, he's not smiling. That's just the shape of his face, or her face. Like, you can just tell by the way it is. Okay? But we humans tend to anthropomorphize. That is, put human characteristics, motivation, reasoning, behaviors onto animals and our perception and understanding of them. And it is not great, but it is instinctual. Our brains are pattern recognitions. We are contrast enhancement engines electrically. So we see the world, we look out at the trees, and we say, the blue part is sky, and the brown part up there is not sky, because the color and the shape are different, right? So fundamentally, our brains are looking for things that we can attribute to human-like values or understanding, because we understand the world from a human perspective, okay? This is a very noisy GIF, isn't it? Like, you can almost hear that. Does anybody have a friend who's ever made that expression? No, you don't. This is not a human, right? So your friend can't make a non-human, right? But we tend to see or map a lot of similarity onto these things. That's anthropomorphization, okay? And kids' movies lean pretty hard into this, right? If anybody saw Zootopia, right? There you go. All right. So good. Right? This is not a good idea. But there are a lot of videos like this, which means that a lot of people think this is at least enough of a good idea to capture on film and upload. Okay? So there you go. Moving on. Goddamn influencers. Teaching us how not to interact with wildlife. Moving on. I get salty about influencers. Okay, how about this one? Now, higher order mammals that can adopt trained behaviors muddy the waters. This is not, I'm showing this to qualify that this is not a park-like environment. This is a for-profit commercial entertainment industry. That is, some people say, exploitive of animals, right? Free Willy. But the fact is, this kind of thing makes a ton of money. So it's probably not going away unless laws get passed against it. We are working against people's understanding of wildlife being trained, essentially circus animals, right? They see this, they remember this, they come to your park, and then they're super mad when, you know, the bear bites their kid's face off for some reason, whatever. Anyway, so yeah, we've got a ton of these. We've got to skip on through here. And we'll say books too. All right, how about this one? All right, so this is at a rhino sanctuary. Animals, they're just like us. No, they're not. Right? So this gives people an idea of, okay, a large creature that's sort of more or less shaped like this, we can do things like this because I saw somebody doing it and they didn't get splattered. Right? As dumb as that sounds, like this happens thousands of times a year just in America's national parks alone. Every year people are gored, that is, they have their chest cavity punctured by mountain goat, Dall sheep, caribou, elk, right? And, you know, survive or not, but the encounter happens in the first place because people are thinking along this line and behaving with another species entirely, not having a trained and controlled situation like that, and so forth. Okay? So we're in the ag sciences part of the building, so I have to put something in there about horses. Horses are highly emotionally impactful creatures to humans. Look at those big soulful eyes, right? They're always trying to get in your pocket to get the treat or the apple you got for them or whatever, right? So we have people interacting with these selectively bred over the last 10,000 years, but still fundamentally non-human creatures, and, you know, getting hurt or butt hurt because the creature isn't doing what the human maybe romantically thought it might. So this is a picture from the Illinois State Horsemen's Association. You can have your horse cremated, and they have like boxes to store the ashes, right? So in the past 15, 20 years, you can get your dog or your cat cremated, now your horse. That's a very, very, very human, that's a profoundly human thing to do, right? So we think about charismatic species very, very, very differently than less charismatic ones, regardless of whether it's safe or logical or anything, right? The emotional appeal, we are highly emotional creatures as humans, all right? So see if you can relate with the people's responses to this. That is a sick moment. These people are never going to forget this instant in their lives, right? And they're in whale habitat, right? So it's not hard to put together. So this is a killer whale, an orca. And that's a very, very small one. That's a baby, that's a little calf, right? What shape does that stand-up paddleboard look a lot like to an orca underneath it? A seal. What do orca love to eat? Seals, right? So, catching a Zen vibe puts us in wildlife habitat, and the wildlife don't have to believe in the power of our hopes and dreams or our mellow, right? Like Jack Johnson in the waterproof earbuds. I'm doing great. I'm getting such a great core workout. Oh God, I'm being eaten, right? That happens. And the wildlife are just trying to do their thing. So this is a feeding behavior among whales in the Pacific Northwest. They corral a bunch of fish inside the bubble plumes, and then eat the concentrated fish. Super exciting, and the whales are just trying to eat. Okay. This is amazing. I'm just going to show this one. This doesn't have a lot to do. They're teaching sea turtles how to make it from the sand hatchery to the waterline and how to swim. Simulating wave action. Look at your faces, look at your smiles, right? We have an emotional payload with this. So your visitors to your national park are going to respond like this to your charismatic species. And they're going to do things that may not make a lot of sense until we understand how powerful, how affective this is in changing somebody's emotional state. Gangly newborns, so cute. Oh my gosh, can't even walk. There you go. All right, happy feet, great movie. Moving on. This is exhausting. Whales just checking out. Is that a seal? Nope, okay. Sometimes it's not just a tower flyby. Thanks, Maverick. It is something that doesn't end well, and we don't tend to get as many videos of those because the camera gets eaten along with a person. But exotic things are exciting and have to be protected extremely thoroughly and assiduously. The fragility, this is about as fragile as an organism as trying to make a sculpture out of wet tissue paper, right? So in an aquarium context, if you have these, you have to constantly be circulating the water so they can move and feed. And if there is the slightest sharpness anywhere on anything in that tank, it can't have like pebbles or gravel in it, right? That will shred these. They are literally like wet tissue. Unbelievable. All right, trophy specimens. If you guys are waterfowl hunters, eat your heart out. I bet he's having a nice dream. I didn't even know a fur seal's dream, right? Like the anthropomorphization. Moving on. Oh God, so cute. I'm ovulating. This is so beautiful, right? Rubby on the tum-tum. Bengal tigers can be up to 800 pounds and crush you fatally just by leaning against you, right? They can break your ribs and your ribs puncture your organs. That's a thing. This is an extremely supervised kind of environment, and people just don't think that through. All right. Look at that hair. Maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline. Okay. Moving on. This is from summer camp. Mustangs and wild horses. Mustangs are ponies. On the open range out west. This is literally out the side of our summer camp bus on the highway. That's pretty cool. We've also had feral horses stampede through our campsite on Cumberland Island National Seashore, the little campground they have there. That was terrifying, and that is absolutely okay for those horses to do, but they don't really tell you that in the visitor center, right? We are going into wild animals or feral animals territory and trying to do human things, expectations. Haha, moving on. All right, so let's kind of jump past a few of these here. So orangutan, pound for pound, are significantly more powerful than humans to the point of being able to pull limbs off and beat you to death with your own arm. Not that they do that a lot, but hey, it's a thing. But my gosh, that looks like a cool photo. I bet it'd be fun to go on a safari and find some orangutan. Yeah. Moving on. A little bit closer to home, we have a lot of a surprisingly, but maybe not surprisingly, huge number of stories, anecdotes, after-action reports of people doing things like putting honey on their child's hand and then pushing the child toward a bear, not at a zoo, in your national park. And then the bear bites the entire hand off, and the kid, runs horrified back. Like, it's not an urban legend. This happens with some regularity, right? People will do anything for a photo, not really thinking through what's going on. Okay. A lot of the stuff that makes it to Good Morning America, which is a TV show, which is the thing that your parents used to watch. A lot of that stuff, right? Heavily curated. And there's a so-called survivorship bias to media like this that makes it out. This is not for all the money in the world could you get me to do that. This experience survey reads, "Our visit was wonderful, but we never saw any bears. Please train your bears to be where guests can see them. This was an expensive trip to not get to see bears." This is not a joke. People are mad when you don't give them a zoo-like experience, and they will go to lengths to set up that zoo-like experience for themselves, right? Now again, this is one person who actually had the courage or the stupidity to write it down. Multiply this by how many millions of people are entering your gate each year, okay? Thoughts and prayers for Dad on this one. On the upside, birth control is expensive. Anyway, so this is a shot from the TV show Lost, which might have been around when you guys were getting born. Anyway, another horse girl video. Here we go. All right. So you guys remember the ice bucket challenge for multiple sclerosis? Dump a bucket of ice water on yourself. Why should the horse do anything other than freak out, right? That makes sense in retrospect, but people aren't thinking with sense. They're thinking with their hearts. Okay. It's a captive cat program rehab. So much fun. So much fun. Moving on. So charismatic. Give Daddy a hug. All right. There we go. And then we get a lot fewer of these videos because they don't tickle our brains in the same way as the feel-good big cat giving me a hug video, right? That's somebody's dream. Literally getting shat on, right? And this is a pretty benign example. This is still in a controlled environment, right? And then we put people out into the wild, and it's a little bit different because got to throw in the Jurassic Park reference, right? So we have things like murder hornets and tarantula hawks, which are wasps about that size that sting full-size tarantulas, paralyze them, drag them across the desert floor in places like Arizona and New Mexico back to their dens and lay their eggs in the still living but paralyzed tarantula, right? Imagine a gunmetal blue hornet about this big and just feels like death, like top 10 most painful stings kind of list of an organism, right? Those are in places like Chiricahua National Monument or, anywhere in Arizona. Yeah. So perception doesn't match reality. All right. Cool. Yeah. Moving on. All right. So that's that one. That is how our visitors are thinking about stuff, and an hour and 15 minutes in, I think we kind of get the idea. Any questions? Comments? All right, let's focus now more on the organisms themselves, and if you are not interested in seeing dead animals and so forth, then, maybe look at your notes a lot. So, we have constructive versus destructive consumptive uses. Consumptive uses are going to be where we go to not just observe the wildlife, but to catch them and eat them, to taxidermy them, to consume them in one way or another. So we can do that constructively in a tightly managed hunting program kind of kind of way, like on the Shawnee. And in the wilderness areas on the Shawnee, you can hunt deer, no big deal. Versus destructive consumptive use, harming the animals just kind of for your entertainment. And yeah, so hunting and fishing, generally okay, very tightly managed these days, right? We have whole majors devoted to this stuff, not a big deal. Look at that, John Schoonover. The man, the myth, the legend. Sometimes on the cold winter nights, if you listen very carefully, they say you can hear him out there hunting. All right. So, our impacts to wildlife as a function of recreation are from a relatively small set of research studies because they tend to rely heavily on individual cases or anecdotes. So we don't have huge statistical tallies of every time that somebody's harassed a deer at Great Smoky Mountains National Park or an elk there. We do have a whole bunch of highly illustrative stories, and it's easy to mentally sort of extrapolate this out across hundreds of thousands to millions of visitors in a place. All right, so unmanaged hunting and fishing, overtake, stuff like that, we are the global super predator. We can absolutely decimate populations in a season or two with poorly managed hunting, right? And it's hard, it's non-trivial work. The hunting itself is also difficult, right? So, funny hijinks, but you know, the animal's running for it. It's like, okay, moving on. Sorry guys, that's how it goes sometimes. And poaching is now, I mean, they're still paying the poachers enough to put their lives in danger. So that is a thing. Here in the United States, poaching tends to look like, at least locally for us, people driving up from like Mississippi, where the deer kind of suck, to poach our trophy specimens and then bring them back down south, and so forth. So we're going to call these direct wildlife impacts. That is, we're not modifying the habitat around them. We're not fragmenting the habitat and cutting them off from a food source, for example. We're directly having an in-person encounter through hunting, through poaching, through HBV, hit by vehicle, which, according to one major study, we're looking at about 1 million vertebrates per day in the United States getting run over or through a windshield or something like that, right? Very, very, very high. And a large portion of those are snakes and other vertebrate reptiles. Okay, moving on. I have a weird sense of humor, guys, so when you come across non sequitur slides like that, just let it roll off and keep on going. All right, moving on. Non-consumptive impacts are going to be for things like we're still encountering, but we're taking a photo instead of taking the animal back, and so forth. Okay? And we can handle a whole lot of non-consumptive recreation stuff, right? You know, if we have people, or we're in some cases require people to use those big, like 300 to 800 millimeter telephoto lenses, like you see at the side of a sports event or field, you know, high-speed photography, long distance, right? You can be 3/4 of a mile away and get a crystal clear photo with professional equipment. So it's an important function of keeping your wildlife safe, hear this, to have beautiful, like coffee table, big, large format photo books of professionally photographed individuals of your wildlife species at your national park, so that people don't feel like they have to get that shitty cell phone picture with like the 2x digital zoom lens, and they gotta get right up on the animal to even get like that blurry photo, right? So if you provide satisfaction of that motivation, seeing the wildlife in the visitor center nobody watches DVDs anymore, but that's what you can sell in a visitor center, right? In coffee books, stuff like that, and puzzles and junior ranger guidebooks, stuff like that. People love that stuff because it's helping them scratch that itch in a way that they can't do safely otherwise for them or the wildlife. So we're big time in favor of having gift shops in national parks for that reason. Okay, so direct impact in terms of injury, desert tortoises getting run over by ATVs, sea turtles getting hit by boats, by ATVs on the beach, alligators having airboats ramp off of them. ATVs collapsing lizard burrows in dry habitats in the Southwest. And we have a whole lot of miles of road, and every 80 kilometers, which is every 50, 60 miles? No, less than that. We have a dead reptile. That's a lot of them. And unfortunately, with our bigger, most charismatic species, especially with moose and elk and so forth, their legs are just tall enough that the engine block on a vehicle when the animal's crossing the road or licking salt at the side of the road, which we are having to salt because our parks have a lot of high elevation roads that snow over faster and freeze and are less safe. The legs are just tall enough that the engine block takes out the legs and the body mass goes through the cabin of the vehicle, killing one or everybody in that vehicle. Even our just horrifyingly large F-150s with the lift kit, like Florida Georgia Line once sang, right? Like, a moose is 7 feet high at the shoulder. They're enormous. And so they can absolutely crush people lots of times. These are prop strikes on a whale, a cetacean, right? So as the propeller is going, it goes chop, 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 chop all along the animal. Now, a lot of cetaceans have sometimes feet of blubber between their vital organs and the outer surface of skin. So this is not necessarily a fatal injury, but it's a hell of a lot of injuries, and there's no benefit of this, right? This is all just downside. So to the extent that you're working at a marine national park or anything coastal, you have to take a real close look at what kind of motor vehicle use are we allowing on the water relative to our species distribution, in particular at certain times of year. So whales are very mobile along coasts to go up and down for like the summer versus the winter fishery, for example, to get their food and their calories in. And that puts them in not so much international shipping lanes, which are going crosswise, but along onshore, nearshore traffic, like water skis, stuff, boats out at the beach kind of thing. Okay. So yeah. Here's one we can relate to locally with silver carp. This can be a fatal event. So silver carp or Asian carp jumping in Illinois waterways, in water bodies, they're agitated by the frequencies that outboard motors run at and jump out of the water. One of those, 20, 30 pound fish hitting you at 50 miles an hour has the muzzle energy of a bullet. And that's enough to kill somebody, right? So the soft tissue of your brain kind of ricochets off the front and back of your skull and tears everything apart, so you get a concussion at best, or killed at worst. So people who've worked with IDNR over the summers, for example, hopefully anybody gets some experience with IDNR over the summers, doing anything. They have to send people out with metal trash can lid shields, or they'll enclose in fence the cockpit of the vehicle instead of having the useless plexiglass thing. Get it? Don't say I never did anything funny for you. All right. Harassment, this is totally on us humans, right? So some of those prop strikes, some of those direct impacts, injury are unknowingly done by humans. Harassment is absolutely an active, conscious thing, right? So graffitiing up cadavers, harassing wildlife, so moving inside their so-called flight radius, the distance at which they will respond to you behaviorally, right? A lot of birds get killed every year, especially in places where something like a Labor Day fireworks display, so late in the season in September, when some of the migratory species are up in the air, this can cause real problems. This is a new one. So as researchers have figured out that polar bears are rapidly fragmenting and losing ice floe habitat, right, people are getting real close. And this is absolutely preventable. If they're using those long-distance telephoto lenses, they get the same photo at the same quality, but without direct impingement or harassment on the animal. Okay, so here's one or a couple of videos from summer camp at Grand Canyon, and there's a massive bull elk, full antlers, up in velvet, so probably a 5, 6, 7 foot.
All right, the man behind the tree.
And
Here
people are just rocking up on it,
is
getting
about
closer and closer.
15
and closer.
meters
This is about
away
2013, 2014,
from a
when cell
mature
phone cameras
bull
were
elk
particularly bad.
with
You can see
antlers
how
and
bad
velvet.
that is. And so folks are getting right up next to
There's a
this thing.
family of 4,
and luckily, this
including
elk has
2
seen
small
so many
children,
people. This is a campground with up to a few
about
thousand people in it. at any
20
given time.
meters away.
It's habituated. But for the most part, it is
Here's the bull here.
just trying to eat, right? This is at 7,000 feet. Winters here suck. We had a snowstorm here on May 26th one year. We got like 6 or 7 inches of snow for about a week in May. This is a hard place for elk to live, but it's way harder when you have adults and children just rocking up on it. All right, so here's another one. It's the elk in the background. You can see it there. Sorry for my shaky cam. I did the best I could for science. It was super awkward filming people making bad decisions and unsafe decisions. So luckily we don't have to do this every time, but every time we go to Grand Canyon or anywhere else with big wildlife, we get this. Like, this is ongoing. This is all the same encounter. People just following the thing along. Here's somebody doing the same thing, feral horses at Cumberland Island. Just walking towards. So watch what the horse is doing. Okay, we're getting from the human incursion to the animal response. The animal is paying attention, so it is alert to the person. Okay, and then here's a couple minutes later. We've gone from alert past alarm, where the animal stops what it is doing, to displacement behavior. Now, the horses are relatively large compared to this person, so they're not evading, they're not sprinting away, where they have a very high probability of having some kind of an injury. Horses are just trying to explode biomechanically. And yeah, so this is happening all the time. All right. Human howling causes stress to wolves, but there was a really cool old Metallica song, Of Wolf and Man, which was quoting Henry David Thoreau, one of the forestry bros close in our hearts, on the development of forestry and natural resource. But yeah, in practice, in a zoo setting or in the wild, we don't want people being dumbasses, right? Also, our technology is moving us and our equipment into much, much more habitat than even 5-10 years ago. Quite a bit more. Drones are outlawed at national parks for this reason. Drones are terrifying to most wildlife species because they can't figure out what it is. It is positioned like a predatory bird, but it doesn't sound like a bird. It sounds like a human, and it doesn't move like anything they've ever seen, right? So lots of examples of ungulates, bison, stuff like that, stampeding to their deaths over cliffs, having been driven that way by drones. And most of the consumer-grade drones, like the little DJI Phantoms or whatever, that most folks are bringing to national parks and wanting to use on your wildlife, are not great cameras. Like, they're not cinematography level octocopters or 16-engine drones with a big, heavy camera. They are just tiny little things where you got to get pretty close in, where they are loud and so forth. So, dolphins are almost unique in all of animaldom in not regarding humans as predators. That is absolutely the exception more than the rule. So we got to understand that the default sense of pretty much every other species encountering a human is, I'm about to get eaten or killed or dragged off or something like that, right? With every human that they encounter. So that's a very stressful, impactful, dangerous thing for them to have to experience over and over and over. So cool. So cool. Like manta rays, right? Imagine if you are a manta ray and you have the global apex super predator diving at you, right? That's a little stressful. So all this is harassment. And one of the primary ways that harassment takes shape at a national park is going to be a bear jam, an elk jam, species name jam, where they're at the side of the road, rearing their young, feeding, just hanging out, whatever. And so people pull off one car, get out of the car, walk towards the animals. The other people see that somebody's pulled off, so they pull off, get out, walk towards the animals, holler over to the other people, hey, what are you doing? And then they encircle the animals on a couple of sides. Let's see if we can get a couple quick examples of this. Let's see here. Rocky Mountain National Park. Let's see. Caribou Jam. So reindeer. There's 80 or 100 of them there. And all day long, this. Constant harassment. And of these people, a few will dip down much closer and just like walk into the herd of caribou and do their thing. Even your professor was young and in his 21s. Yikes. Yikes. Big yikes, as the youth say. Okay, so this is a caribou jam. People walking in traffic. Kids walking in traffic. And at Rocky Mountain National Park, this is kind of allowed to happen at Grand Teton National Park, where the bison are walking across the road and headbutting cars and denting them or flipping cars up on two wheels kind of thing. They have to have a staff of dozens of people, dedicated biologists and volunteer staff, to get this stuff done. Okay, moving on. Elk jam at Great Smokies at low elevation. Sorry, my camera sucks, but yeah. They're there, they're right there. Oh my God, pull over the car, honey, pull over the car. Get some biscuits or some milk bones or something. I think we got some in the back for the dogs. Let's see if the caribou eat them. Or elk, or whatever. Jam 2, you get the idea. Mule deer look like whitetail, they're just like shaggier. They're kind of the forestry professor version of a whitetail deer, and people are super excited to see them. A lot of people in a lot of countries don't have deer. Like, we just kind of take deer for granted as forest rats, you know? Yeah. Night elk jam at Grand Canyon. I try to get good images of that one, but the sensor on my camera didn't work out so well. So, pets in parks. This is a harassment issue, and pets don't have even what little restraint some humans have during wildlife encounters. So, let's take a couple quick looks at those. Oh my gosh, this is why we do it. This is literally why we do it. We treat animals as members of our families, empathically and emotionally. And this is a dog getting at mountain goat habitat, right? Evil. So, here we go. And this is the thing. If we can kind of sum up most of our wildlife, everything into this video. My dog never does stuff like this, is the line you hear over and over, almost word for word often. My dog never does stuff like this. I don't know what got into him. He never does stuff like this. Not my dog, right? So the rationalization, the denial, the cognitive dissonance of it, it is a lot. So the typical default multiplier is ×4. Your dog hikes 4 times the mileage and has 4 times the wildlife encounters, and at much closer range and at higher speed and a higher threat profile than you do as a human. So people bringing their dogs to national parks, this is a thing. Here's a action camera on a dog. Look how mobile this animal is. relative to the human present, right? Jumping over walls, hardcore parkour, and so on and so forth. But you get the whole thing, right? But surely not my dog, right? My dog is beautiful and has those big puppy eyes, and so forth. So you got to hold the line on this one pretty hard. Everybody has the same bad ideas about their pets. Moving on with pets, etc. We've seen some of these before. Okay, so forced culling is when somebody has been feeding your wildlife, either on purpose or by accident, and they are either sick or food attracted now as a wildlife behavioral response, and now are going to put themselves and people in tremendous danger. So our wildlife behavioral responses are alert, alarm, displace, low speed, evade, high speed, start hanging around dumpsters, etc., food attract, or as we saw with that bull elk at Grand Canyon, they can habituate, meaning they are aware of your presence, they just don't care anymore. And finally, they can charge, either aggressively, meaning to do you harm, or defensively, meaning to scare you off. And so forced culling is a result of mostly food attraction, but sometimes happens otherwise as well. This one's just a joke. But let's see. We got to understand that you and I, as Americans, are one percenters in terms of socioeconomic status across the world. As long as we're above essentially poverty line here in the United States, we are one percenters globally. Mammals are very much the same way in terms of wildlife, right? This is not a natural system that we're dealing with. They are clinging to what last core refugia remain and are managed as parks and forests. Okay? So, moving on. Let's take a look. So, marine wreck overlap. So moose are famous for, moose can be covered in ticks and mosquitoes in the Great North Woods, and so they'll hang out underwater for minutes at a time, and it's fairly easy to not be able to see down into that water, park a canoe over top of the moose, and the moose freaks out because moose are dumb. And they flip the canoe, drown the occupants, trample the occupants underwater. It's a bad scene, and the moose gets labeled as the hazard. And so in some of these cases, it's like the families of the people, mauled or killed by the moose who are out canoeing in the moose's own habitat will insist that like a state wildlife officer or game warden or something like that will go out and take the moose because it's a man killer, right? It's dangerous. We're cleaning up our dangerous streets or ponds. It's unfortunate. So that's a forced cull. And where bears, for example, scare people away from habitat encroached spots like golf courses, particularly out west, and everybody runs for the hills, and the bear rolls through, gets everybody's snack out of the golf cart, and has now learned that they can get human food, high calorie concentration, for just the effort of showing up and scaring everybody off. That's how we get food attraction behaviors. So, sport and rec facilities encroach on habitat, nibble away at it from the edges, and we're generally, as foresters, left protecting what's left beyond that fence line. A single mature black bear, this is a brown bear, much larger, but a single mature black bear, so an eastern black bear like at Great Smokies, needs 100 square miles of habitat for itself in order to be fully successful and so forth, right? So that's a 10 mile by 10 mile chunk. Now think about how big Shawnee National Forest is and how many 10 mile by 10 mile patches we could fit into Shawnee National Forest. More than a few, but not a lot, right? 10 miles is a lot of space. So, tough. And for birds, significantly bigger than that. Orca as well. This is a fishhook embedded in a raptor claw. That is an unfortunate milk ring on a turtle. So this video blows my fucking mind. Right? So they're up on a ridgeline, it's very windy, throw something into the wind, into the headwind, and it blows it right back to you. Now how many thousands of bottles are just over that ridgeline, right? How many thousands of bottles are 50 feet down, inaccessible on the other side of the leeward side of the ridgeline? Like, this is the kind of nonsense that you and I, as rangers, unfortunately, are going to have to police pretty hard as it goes. All right, so indirect impact is going to be the habitat modification, the fragmentation, degradation, nibbling in from the sides, like we see with golf courses and so forth. But sand rails and dune buggies, collapsed rodent burrows and marginal arid habitats. So pack rats, for example, like each individual bush in the Sonoran Desert floor is its own little ecosystem, right? So the single plant is doing evapotranspiration, moving what limited moisture is in that environment. It's mounding soil in its root ball, and into that, rodents, typically lizards, will burrow their nests and habitats. Well, a sand rail or dune buggy is lots of fun to hit one of those little shrubby bushes at high speed, right? You can get up on two wheels and ride on the dunes on two wheels instead of four, and completely obliterated that habitat in one pass, right? And one person with high travel suspension and a plan can kill off a bunch of desert habitat real fast. So desert ATV use is a big issue, or arid ATV use is a big issue in like Central California, Southwest, places like that. A lot of interdiction happens and coordination across law enforcement agencies with that. We've talked about compacting snow trails, tunnels for folks, and we've already talked about an exotic invasive species competition with vegetation, and keystone species with vegetation with composition change. Same thing is true with wildlife, but generally speaking, we can see fairly quickly, and we're paying a lot of attention to keystone species, right? Rare, threatened, or endangered species count as keystone species functionally, and those are very charismatic animals. So if their populations start to decline in a park, we can respond to that and notice that very quickly, but yeah. So roads fracture habitat for anything smaller than our mobile mesocarnivore type species. Okay. And it's not just the road itself, it's a pretty wide buffer, 400 meters, about a quarter mile strip on both sides of the roads. Now, that's not to say we'll never see elk and deer on roads, we absolutely do, right? But we gotta understand that, when a vehicle rolls by, an elk's natural flight radius is about 1,550 meters, about 1 mile. So any kind of traffic on that road means not just the road itself is being affected in terms of habitat. It's a 1,550 meter strip on either side of the road acoustically that makes it less attractive for deer and elk and stuff like that. Okay? So that's fine, except if we are cutting the animals off from the key habitat that they need to make it through the winter, then that's the issue. Okay? So, law of the road, man. So the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is the big poster example for pulling out all that barbed wire, for closing down a bunch of old roads and renaturalizing them so that dynamics like this can happen, so that the bison and the wolves can run it out instead of getting trapped into a corner and freezing to death by the thousands in a trapped space in the cold Yellowstone winter. So there are success stories with this. We can unfragment habitat by pulling out old, unfunctional, non-functional land management practices, but a lot of the easy stuff has been done, right? So that fragmentation can be temporary or permanent. And your forest stand composition. Does anybody know what monarch butterflies absolutely need in terms of species composition of forests for habitat?
Milkweed.
They need milkweed for food, and for their entire reproductive cycle, they need old growth oak. Now, how much old growth oak do we have left, right? Not much. Yeah, so. And monarchs are commuting thousands of miles back and forth each year. So this is like an international forestry management concern. If we don't get it right at all the stops along the way, they're pretty well screwed. So the monarchs are actually kind of a halfway success story. It's still being worked out, but it is absolutely a thing. Also climate change. So far, we're not seeing the worst of it yet. But this year was probably the coolest year of the rest of your lives, right? And it was also the hottest year on record, so there's that. We got that going for us. That's a thing. And wild pigs. Oh. Pigs go feral in a matter of days to weeks. They're highly mobile, highly intelligent. They reproduce rapidly, and they shred. They cause millions and millions of dollars worth of damage to lands, public and private. So sometimes some swine operation that's miles and miles from you has a fence line failure or a containment failure, and then all of a sudden it is now your problem, and it is literally dangerous for you to go out there and do forestry stuff because you might get gored by a boar. It's a very decidedly medieval way to go in 2024. Such is life. So here's what that can look like. Has anybody ever been to or come across a hog wallow like in the Shawnee or at your family's farm? Just they'll shred an entire area, just take it over. It's nuts. So at least Texas. Texas is interesting and complex in lots of ways, and we'll finish on this thought. Texas has turned feral hog hunting into not just an industry where if you like shooting sports, for example, and you develop your skills as a sharpshooter, you can hook up with a helicopter company and use military-grade night vision optics and go sharpshooting hogs. It's also turned into an entertainment industry down there, right? There are TV shows, and you can now pay outfitters and guides to take you out there and shoot feral hogs. As a nuisance species, they are pretty excellent at disrupting native species habitat, and so everybody is incentivized to take care of that. All right, so I think that's it. Let's go ahead and pack up from here, and let's talk about the final project.